Okay, we are back from our lunch break. It's still Thursday, July 29th. We're going to be hearing from Chris Roop from Joint Fiscal about the impact of one-time monies.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal Office. The chairs asked me to spend a little bit of time today going over the impact of one-time money, because I know that was a subject that sort of glossed over rather quickly in one of the earlier sessions. So wanted to maybe revisit this conversation and try to draw your attention back and just make sure we all have sort of a clear understanding and make sure that if you have any questions that we're answering them. So I passed out a one-pager that is substantially similar to the one I gave out a few weeks back at the first task force meeting, and we'll also post an electronic version online. The only real difference is I added a bar chart on page 2 that I'll get to, but really was an attempt to try to put some scale and some context around these numbers to show what $150 million sort of compares to in a visual format to the size of the unfunded liabilities in both systems. So let me start at the very, very top. I just wanted to remind everybody that as part of last year's budget process, the General Assembly reserved $150 million in the general fund and $14 million in the education fund to support public pension and OPEB funding recommendations to be made by this group. So one of the charges of this task force that the broader legislature is hoping to get out of the report that we're all going to be working on over the next few months is some recommendations on how best to spend it. So there's obviously a lot of really compelling reasons why it's a good idea to put one-time money in the pension fund earlier. And it's really due to the fact that, you get to take advantage of compound interest. And, we are in a closed amortization system, which really means what happens between fiscal 09 and fiscal 38 is the time frame of the numbers that matter most to us right now, because that is the time by which we need to amortize our unfunded liability. So, I showed an example, a graph on one of my earlier presentations, I think on the first day, that just shows, if you were to invest $1 million at 7% and let it grow for 30 years, it grows to over $7 million over 30 years. Well, we don't have 30 years from now until 2038, which is really the time that matters most for our actuarial math right now, because that's the date by which we need to pay off our unfunded liabilities. So we have 16 years. So what does $150 million grow to at 7% over 16 years? It's still pretty substantial. It won't grow from, a million. It won't grow by a factor of 7+, but it will grow by just about a factor of 3. So if you put $150 million in right now, and it steadily grew just at a very simple compound interest formula over a period of 16 years, you end up with roughly $448 million. So roughly, threefold compared to the 150 you started with. These numbers are scalable. So if you wanted to see what it looked like with $50 million instead of $150 million, well, 50 is a third of 150. So take a third of 448 or whatever, or 442 or whatever the number is on here, and that will relatively get you what the 50 would grow to. So there's a scalability here. Everything kind of grows by the same rate year over year. So $150 million, as you heard from some of the presentations from my colleagues earlier, is a pretty substantial amount of money in the scope of Vermont's budget. $150 million is very significant amount of money to be held in reserve for funding purposes. But in the context of the overall pension landscape, $150 million doesn't get you that far. I broke out here in this chart on the top, just if we put $75 million in today based on FY20's numbers, give you a sense of scale of what of an impact that would have. And you can see that that $75 million would improve the VSERS funding ratio by about 2.4%. And the teacher funding ratio by about 1.4%, by about 1.9%. So, this is all due to the scale of the liabilities. $150 million is not a huge amount of money when you put it in that context specifically. However, as I mentioned, that money would be expected to grow over time. And every dollar you earn in interest in the future is a dollar that does not need to be paid into the system from tax dollars. So there is an efficiency argument to be made for putting money in as soon in the amortization schedule as you can, because you benefit from more years of compound investment. Is that concept clear? Anybody have any questions? Okay. The other thing that we want to keep in mind, in addition to that $150 million, is the legislature also reserved $14 million in the education fund. The education fund has been paying the normal cost of the teacher pension system up to this point, the employer share of the normal cost. So when Steve was running through his numbers earlier, the $37 million employer share of the normal cost gets charged to the ed fund, and the roughly $152 million contribution toward paying down the unfunded liability falls to the general fund. That $37 million certainly is a smaller number than 150, but that number grew by $30 million from FY21 to FY22. So the rate of growth in that has been substantial. The legislature, when they were putting the budget together for FY22 at the end of the last session, there was some back and forth over whether to start pre-funding OPEB by starting a practice of paying the normal cost of the teacher OPEB. This is a cost that we currently are not funding because we're only paying the PAYGO. We're only paying the actual cost of providing healthcare benefits to today's retirees. If we were to fund the normal cost, that starts us down the path of systematically setting aside money every year so it can grow through investment gains and fund the benefits that today's workforce is going to need when they retire. The normal cost conveniently worked out to be about 13.8 million and change. So the legislature decided to not make a decision on funding the normal cost of the OPEB yet, but reserve that money and ask this task force as part of its work to offer some recommendations moving forward on what to do. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So it's not just $150 million that recommendations are going to be expected for. It's going to be that 150 plus the $14 million in the ed fund that are reserved right now. Sir.
If teacher OPEB is moved in FY39, does that mean that all to a pre-funding method instead of PAYGO? Does that mean that all teacher pension costs would come out of the fund at that point moving forward?
No, I don't think so. So that's a very far distance in the future. And right now, we can't predict what the legislature will do between now and 2038. But if the current statutory scheme stayed in place and we were 100% funded at 2038 on the pension side, then the employer share of the normal cost would continue to be funded out of the ed fund. And any unfunded liability that may arise would be charged to the general fund. Right now, nothing on the OPEB side is being paid out of the ed fund. So it's hard to really predict what's going to happen in the next 16 years. But the default position right now, if the current law were to stand, is that the normal cost would continue to fall to the ed fund. And the normal cost is projected to grow with payroll.
A different question as we're talking about one-time funds. I know for myself, I need more clarity on what one-time funds do for the ADEC.
So yeah, that's a great question. You would need the actuary to model that out and based on sort of the most latest data. Generally speaking, if all of your actuarial assumptions are met, put more money in at the front end will lower your ADECs in subsequent years, because every dollar that lump sum can grow through investment gains in future years is a dollar that it's hard to say definitively that if we put $150 million in today, it would lower the ADEC by X dollars next year, because we just don't know. This is one of many factors that goes into the equation.
What's the impact of 1 year? So we know 16 years, $150 million is worth roughly 450. What is it at 15 years? How much is that 1 year worth? Right now, obviously each year you get closer, you have a.
It depends on which year in the amortization schedule you're in. So year 16 is going to have a bigger sort of investment impact or sort of opportunity cost than year 2, for example, because of the compounding interest factor.
Do we know what that is, or is there a chart that could just show that out?
Prepare a chart, sure.
Be great, thanks. I think just important for everyone to see how important that dollar today is, because the dollar tomorrow might be worth, $6 less or something like that.
Absolutely. And the magnitude of that grows significantly over time.
Chris, on the ADEC point, understanding that the growth of that money, that would involve the actuary, but just paying down the unfunded liability, that reduces the sum that you're amortizing over that period. So like, it seems like it would be a simple thing to find out, like, just for next year or whatnot. Because that ongoing, that is an important benefit. We talk about the fiscal pressures, and that would reduce them to a certain degree, going forward.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think what you would want the actuary to model is take the FY21 valuation data, the latest data, using the latest investment returns smoothed according to the smoothing policy, and get the latest numbers and say, all right, in a status quo situation, what do the next 16 years of amortization payments look like? Then if you were to drop X number of dollars above and beyond the ADAC in whichever fund, however you all decide you would want it modeled, they could show you what that impact would be in future years. But the big caveat to this is these numbers all change every year.
So just a quick future calculate, see that 1 year, it's about in the 440s, that 16 year going to the 15th year, it's 413. So you lose like $30 million on just delaying a year, putting that in. Like that's how big this next year is, and each year it gets.
This, and Senator Parent's point hones in on why a lot of financial advisors tell people that it's really important to start saving for retirement early in your careers. Because if you can let your retirement savings grow by 40 years over your working life, as opposed to starting to save when you're 34 and having a much shorter time horizon to watch that money grow, it makes a very, very big difference in how much money you have available to retire. Time is your friend with compound interest.
Corey, I didn't catch the numbers you were referring to.
So if we put 150 million in today and return 7% at 16 years, it's like 440 something $million. Just a quick future value calculation, 443. If you did it over 15 years, just change the 16 to a 15, it's 413.85. So it's about a $30 million difference just in delaying a year. If we're going to put 150 million in this year versus next year, just delaying that a year cause that unfunded liability cost it $30 million. If every other thing, but that's how important it is to figure this out this year, because every year you delay, you're losing those chunks. I mean, really, it's a shame we lost this last legislative session because there's a chance we lost $30 million just delaying a year.
But we're also, on the flip side, I think we're probably at the high end of the market rather than the low end of the market. So
We have a good
we
opportunity.
don't necessarily know if putting that money in after we just got a 25% return is a good idea or not. This is sort of the timing risk in all of this is, you make these long-term assumptions, but if you were to invest a whole bunch of money at the top of the market and then we see things take a nosedive subsequently, that really changes the calculation. So you never know for sure. The best you can do is apply your assumptions and try to make an educated guess and an informed decision with the data you have at the time.
And speaking to that, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how is the buying model? Like when we put like $150 million, let's say one-time money into the fund, does it go in, or do we like spread it out over a period? Because, one of the safe things with like your retirement is you're putting to 401k, you're buying assets every 2 weeks or every week, one time. So
It goes in immediately.
so like you get that timing whenever the market is, like you said, you're instead of, you don't get that, you're not pairing out that buying to an average price,
Not dollar cost averaging.
right? You're just,
So timing is certainly a risk, and it's an element of uncertainty in the whole calculation. But fundamentally, the back of the envelope, simple compound interest calculation certainly favors longevity when you're making investments. Anybody have any other questions on this document or anything else I can answer on here.
So I believe Steve said this morning, I mean, we have a $200 million surplus but 54 million of that is going to the state employees OPEB. So that's in addition to the $150 million that was set aside in the budget. And the $14 million that's in the education fund. So that's,
Put me on the spot for my math. Yeah. But,
Almost 230, 228.
yeah,
228.
out too. That's right. And yeah, just to be clear, that 150, while the 50 and change, the 50 million and change from the general fund surplus is going by statute to the state employee OPEB trust, 150 and the 14 from the ed fund are being reserved right now. So they have not been put into any trust fund. The legislature is waiting for recommendations.
And the rest of that money is by statute goes into our rainy day fund, I believe, the surplus. So
Yeah, and all of those reserves and rainy day funds that the state has are actually a really big strength for the state's financial management. It helps our bond rating that we have such strong reserves in place and that are funded by statute, but also really helps the state's cash flow management as well. You know, a lot of governments have to go out and borrow and pay interest to pay their bills because whenever you have to pay your bills doesn't necessarily neatly jive with when the money comes in. So the fact that we have such healthy reserves certainly helps us on our cash management strategy. And it's one of those things that I think makes Vermont's financial management really stand above a lot of other states.
One of the things I'm wondering about is we keep hearing from people that talk to us about, there's lots of new information, but we don't have it all yet. We have new information that's coming out on demographics, will be released in October. We have information from Secretary Pierce that's coming out in October. We're hoping to get a sneak peek on. How quickly can we turn around and take action when we get those new numbers? Because that really impacts things, knowing that we're trying to put out a report in October, an initial report, and then by December 2nd, we had to have that final report out.
Not sure I understand the question.
As we get that information, how quick of a turnaround trying to factor in some of these things into different calculations? Like if we need the actuary to run a number on something and we're just getting it in October and our report's got to be there.
So we may not have to wait to October in order to run a scenario. You know, we would have to talk to the actuary through the treasurer's office on what is, take your model and the data in the model. And here's the question, we would, do this and tell us what happens. I think you can likely get an answer on that without having to wait 4 months.
Okay.
And Mike, please jump in.
yeah, we did that during the session. We ran models. So it's possible to run models. They may change with the new valuation, but I mean, you can only use the data sets that you have.
And the trends we've been seeing in recent years are not going to be fundamentally changed in an opposite direction from one year's valuation. We had a good year in 21 from an investment return perspective, but not a good enough year to completely solve the challenge. We had a strong investment year, but those gains are not recognized all at once. We have deferred losses from prior years that some of that gain counteracts. So, the likely moving in the funded ratio from one year to another is going to be a small number of percentage points, not, going from 51% to 60%. That's not going to happen.
I have another question. So, Chris, I sent you earlier this morning this memo from Don Tinney and Jeff Bannon, which argues that we should use all of our surplus money for pensions this year. It says that's a sand in the line. If we don't do that, nothing's going to change. He referenced a $1 billion cost based on the underfunding before 2009. Can you comment on that or?
So I appreciate the question. I'm not going to comment on the wisdom of what to do with the surplus. I will, however, make a comment on the number. And, I want to take a step back and just make sure we all have a clear understanding of the actuarial math and how things work. Because I've heard the argument made that if you add up all the amount of underfunding from 1979 to 2006 and apply that to the assumed rates of return, you get some number. I've never done the calculation. It could be 600 million in there. I heard the number a billion. I'm not going to comment on whether a billion is right or not. I can tell you though that it is not accurate to equate lost investment opportunities with missing money from the pension system. And let me explain why. Whenever it's one thing to say, if I had invested this money in 1979, what will it have grown to by now? That answers the question of what is your missed investment opportunity. That's money that we lost out on had, everything worked the way it normally worked and we just had more money in the market. But that does not mean that same amount of money is missing from the pension system, because every year the ADAC is recalculated based on what happened the year previously. In other words, if the system is underfunded in 1979, the ADAC from 1980 moving forward through all of the years till the end of the amortization period goes up when all else is equal, because we have to make up, the employer through the interest in the ADAC makes up for that lost investment opportunity. I am by no means advocating that it is a good idea to underfund the ADAC. You definitely want to make sure that you're taking advantage of market efficiencies and putting money in from the market instead of from tax dollars. But what a lot of people I don't think understand is the nuance of how the ADAC is calculated. The ADAC is not a static amount of money, and you cannot go back and look at what the ADACs were over 40 years and assume that those ADACs would have been the same amount of money in all of those years if something else happened, before that, because what happens in the preceding year influences the calculation for all the future years. So whenever the ADAC is shorted in one year, the future ADACs in every single one of those years remaining in the amortization period will go up a little bit. Similarly, if we beat our investment projections one year or beat our demographic assumptions and have other sort of actuarial gains, that will lower the ADAC a little bit from year to year. So, you can't assume that the ADACs would have been the same amounts they were calculated as going back. And you can't assume the legislature would have made the funding decisions that it made going that far back, because the ADAC calculation really depends on a point in time that changes every year. If you take a look at the valuation studies that are on the Treasurer's website, and I sent a few to Gail to post on the website, there's a page in there, page 20 something, that shows you how it's calculated. And they'll basically take, all right, what was your beginning unfunded liability of the year? What happened during that year? Did you miss your assumptions? Did your assumptions change? What was your investment performance like? What were your actual contributions compared to what you thought? And did the whole grow bigger or not? And they'll take that number, that results, figure out how many more years are left in the amortization schedule, and recalculate all the numbers in the future. So this is a very dynamic process. And none of these numbers are sort of set in stone historically, because what happens before influences what happens going forward. So that's my very sort of long-winded way of just trying to make sure people understand that historic underfunding does not mean that money has just disappeared in the ether. It means that money needs to be made up for in the future years, either through the ADAC or through other actuarial gains.
I totally appreciate your response to that question. I think that $1 billion refers to the conversation we had with Tom Galanka on July 7th. I think that's where that number is coming from, because that's the number that he said in our last meeting.
And that, my understanding is the same with yours. And again, I'm not validating the $1 billion just because I haven't done the calculation. I trust Tom tremendously, but that is referring to sort of the missed investment opportunity cost. So we could have earned that amount of money through interest over years instead of having to make up for it through other ways.
Chris, I agree with what you're saying in terms of each year that ADAC is paid, it's making up for some, it's covering some of that unfunded liability. I guess I would be careful about drawing it from 1980 to now, because of what the treasurer pointed out in her report. There was some, there was that method that was used that didn't really account for unfunded liability, but or it didn't didn't add to the unfunded liability. But your point is spot on. But we are only in year whatever of the amortization schedule. What is it, 13 or so? So we've made some work in making up for that, but there is more work to go. There's still an impact to the plan from those decisions.
And I would actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I would actually say that the most important time period to focus on is from the beginning of FY09 to the present, because we are in a closed amortization period. So we, if you take a look back, notwithstanding changes to, actuarial methodology that happened in the early 2000s, if you go back to the beginning of the current amortization period, the unfunded liability on the teacher side was about $375 million. It's $1.933 billion now. And the ADEC has been fully funded the entire time. The hole has gotten deeper primarily as a result of missing our assumptions, our experience deviating from assumptions, and changing our assumptions. So changing the assumed rate of return over time, changing our demographic assumptions, because we had different, levels of payroll growth, or, different levels of hiring, or things of that nature, different mortality tables. So those changes in assumptions and previous deviations from assumptions are what drove the increase from 2009 to the present. Now, if we started with a $375 million hole to close over 30 years, we probably would not be spending all summer talking about this issue, because that is a much more manageable mathematical problem. The challenge we're facing is that the hole got much, much deeper. If you look at, and it's not just the hole, it's the size of the overall liabilities. That's the total cost of what we owe in our pension benefits, have basically doubled since 2008. So we've seen a very, very substantial growth in that. And as a result, the liabilities have grown faster than the assets. So that gap between them, which is the unfunded liability, has grown in turn. The most significant impact of historic underfunding that happened before FY09 is the fact that when we came in with an opening balance of $375 million, some of that was due to prior underfunding and just missing assumptions in the past and everything else. The fact that we had to start there added some cost to the ADEC for all 30 years, but it is not responsible for how we've seen things grow so significantly in the current amortization period. So what happened before the closed amortization period is kind of like a whole separate chapter in a way of the math from what's happening now. And it's because we really just need to look at what's going on in this 30-year window that we find ourselves in right now, because that is what we need to pay down. We need to pay down that balance and any growth in that balance by a certain date.
But I guess what I want to add to the conversation is that that $375 million unfunded liability or whatever came from somewhere. And so it has implications about where the solution comes from as well. And so if I think about what happened in the spring when the solution was about changes to the benefits of teachers and state employees in a number of different ways, the reaction from that body, those people, was, wait a second, why do we have to do all of this? Why do we have to take care of all of this? Because we've been paying in. And I think that's a really important part of the discussion. It's not just the numbers, because if that 375 million wasn't there in 2009, what would we be dealing with right now?
So the 375 million is not exclusively due to prior underfunding. That could be due to all kinds of experience factors and deviations over the years. But I think the crux of sort of why we're having this conversation right now is, we're not dealing with a $375 million problem in 2022. We're dealing with a problem that's grown by $1.5 billion since then. And it has not grown at it's really not anybody's fault that it grew that way. It's just the fact that the world changed and what we thought would happen didn't necessarily pan out with what actually happened. So I never get in the business of finger pointing or motives or anything like that. We're dealing with reality manifesting itself in sort of a math problem. And this is the uncertainty of sort of defined benefits and long economic horizons. Like we've seen a really unusual convergence of both economic crisis in the Great Recession And, lackluster investment returns over time since then, relative to where they were in the 80s and 90s. And we've seen that coincide with a really, really big demographic bubble of retirees retiring. You go back 60 years and you got the baby boom. So, it's sort of this perfect storm in a way that these factors are happening and happening in the closed 30-year amortization period that we find ourselves in. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't really a question as much as just a statement that I think history matters in the present, and I get all of what you're saying too. I'm not thinking that's, but I do think that piece of the history is an important part of our conversation.
And I mean, to everybody's credit, since the current amortization period has started, both the employees and employers have paid what they're required to do. Employees have continued to make their payroll contributions out of their checks, and the state has fully funded the ADEC, and in some cases exceeded its ADEC funding, which is sort of, the frustrating aspect of this is, everybody tries to do the right thing, yet we still have this problem to wrestle with. So, and unfortunately, the problem has gotten worse over time. As we've gone through the amortization period and not gotten better.
So,
Just a quick comment. I think this discussion here has been great. I think it really underlines our challenge here is that there's lots of different forces that have acted on the pension systems, and we're charged with making recommendations. So to do that, I think we need to really understand all of those different forces to inform those recommendations. And we just talked about a lot of them. Good discussion.
So I'm going to, if there's no more questions for Chris, I'm going to just tell those of you who might be out in wherever you are in the world watching this, we are really not as stiff as we seem on the thing. The camera has been frozen for about the last 15 minutes. And so
Chris Roop is an
has not-
amazing ventriloquist.
yes, he has not moved.
And
And
for video.
so we are going to take just a few seconds here. The only way to solve this is to restart. So we're going to go offline for just a couple minutes here while Gail restarts us.
Are you saying Chris has to redo his entire presentation?
No, because they could read it.
You got to start
And here.
exactly where that.
I'm sure they